Hello everybody, Jake Raby here again, Flat 6 Innovations. I want to welcome you back to another episode from RenVision. I'm coming to you today from the morgue here at Flat 6 Innovations, where we've got a 3.8 liter 997.1 C4S engine that has failed on track. I'm going to take you through this failure, show you all the things that we see that happened, and I'm going to show you how to hopefully keep your connecting rod bolts out of the oil sump. Okay guys, first off you'll notice we're in a little bit different setting than we typically are. I'm not upstairs in the studio, I'm not over in the area where we shoot a lot of the instructional videos. I'm actually in the area where we take cars apart and we tear engines down. We call it the morgue. And the morgue, where we actually tear the engines down at, is a little bit too constrained for us to shoot a good video. So I've pushed the engine out here kind of in the work bay to give you a better idea so we got more room to spread some things out, okay? So first off, I want to tell you, the intent of this video, just like all my other videos, really isn't to scare anybody, okay? We hear the term fearmonger all the time. There's a big difference between a fearmonger and somebody that wants to share facts with you, okay? That's what today is all about. That's what this engine is all about. I receive a ton of emails, submission tickets through our website, post on the website, post on Facebook about on-track failures, okay? And most on-track failures are not as bad or severe as this one is. But most of them share the same things that have led to those on-track failures. And a lot of times, even though the parts don't look quite so bad and we're not picking up pieces of cylinder like this and literally throwing it away, the block's still compromised, the crankshaft carrier's still compromised, the crankshaft's still compromised, it's tossed a rod out the side of the block, whatever the case may be. So all those failures are related to this failure. This one may be extreme, but I just want you to understand this is not about scaring you, it's about helping you understand what makes this happen and how to hopefully avoid it. Okay, so allow me, if you will, to set the stage. So this engine, as you see here, kind of what we call on the half shell, okay? We have bank 2 of the crankcase over here, okay? We have bank 1 with the crankshaft carrier and crankshaft and intermediate shaft, or what's left of these pieces, still intact, okay? This engine came out of a 2007 997.1 C4S. This engine is known as the M97 engine, okay? The first thing a lot of you guys are going to say is, did the IMS bearing fail? No. The IMS bearing is actually the only thing inside this short block of the engine that is still good. The intermediate shaft bearing did not fail with this engine. This is a typical M97 engine failure, and we see this also with a family of M9605 engines, which are the 3.6 liter non-C4S, and we see it with M9721 in the Cayman. We also see it with M9603 in the 2002 up to 2004 996. That could be the C4, could be the X51. All those short blocks share a lot of the same components, okay? So this literally would set the stage for a car from 2002 all the way up through the end of the M97 production in 2008 for your Cayman, for your 997, 996, okay? So that's pretty much what this is. 40,000 miles, actually 41,000 miles indicated on the odometer of this car. The car did see track time. I want to go ahead and tell you now, if you're not somebody that is concerned with tracking your Porsche and extensively tracking the car, then go ahead and turn this video off. The things you're going to see here are not going to happen to your street car, at least not at this level. You will do one of two things before this occurs to you on the street. You will either kill yourself or go to jail before you end up having this level of damage occur on the street with one of these cars. It is physically impossible to do this kind of damage on the street without killing yourself or going to jail. So now I want to take you through some of the components, familiarize you with what you're looking at and the layout. Now the thing I'll tell you, it's pretty hard to see which happened first here, the chicken or the egg. but there were some constants with this particular car that I hear a lot of times, okay? Many of you I'm probably sharing this video with because you've sent a submission ticket through Flat Six Innovations website saying you've had something like this happen, my engine came apart on track, blah, blah, blah. That's one reason I'm producing this video, is to answer your questions and to show you a good example of what you could be looking at as an absolute worst case scenario. So it was important to me to share this with you, which helps me help you understand what it takes to reconstruct this engine and bring it back to life. If you fit that group, and I've sent you a link showing you this video, or if you just happened across it, you're probably going to be in the group just like the owner of this car was. And I can probably take the words out of your mouth about what occurred, because I hear the same thing over and over and over again, probably 50 times a year. Now, basically, I'm not saying anything about how bad these engines are. Let's go ahead and put that out there. But I'm throwing out the things that are constants that lead to this. Things like short shift kits, things like over temperature oil, things that are basically using the wrong kind of oil on the track, not servicing the engine enough before you go to the track. These things lead to this thing occurring, okay? At the end of the day, a bad day at the track is better than a good day at the office. Always remember that, right? I hear that all the time, and I say the same thing. So it can be just bad luck, okay? You're out there on the track. It's a mechanical thing as you're out there, racing around, chasing your tail, burning up gas and wasting money on tires, okay, to have fun. So anything can happen. And in this case, maybe this guy had bad luck. Sometimes that's all it takes. Mechanical things can have a bad day, okay? So not how bad it is, but what occurred. So if you're in that group, more than likely you would be calling to tell me, Jake, I was at X racetrack, either Sebring, which eats these engines, Mid-Ohio, which is where this one failed, Circuit of the Americas in Coda in Texas, Roebling Road in Savannah, Georgia, Barber Motorsports Park in Alabama. A lot of these tracks, especially in the heat of the summer, will generate this kind of failure. Road Atlanta is also a big one because especially the DE there in August every year with PCA, it tends to eat these engines. And that's because we're on track with very high ambient temperatures. That drives things to occur in this engine that normally would not, okay? So if this fits you, where basically you were on the track, everything was going fine, you were 2/3 of the way through a 20-minute session, something like that, you didn't really miss a gear, everything was going fine, all of a sudden you see some smoke, you hear a noise, there's a loud bang, and you pull off the side of the track, okay? That happens to you, don't try to restart the car. If you hear that bang, the engine is not going to start. If you hear the bang, that is the engine screaming to you that it has failed. Don't try to start it. If you try to start the engine again, you're just going to do that much more collateral damage and cost yourself more money. Just like somebody with this engine, where this engine basically has nothing we can reuse. If the engine would have restarted again, it would shoot even more stuff up. So when that happens to you, and you say, oh, I can't believe this just happened to me, well, if you hear the bang, don't try to start it until you have a specialist look at the engine and see what's going on. One start can cost you $5,000, okay? No exaggeration whatsoever. If you've got things out of time in the engine and you go to restart it, those things collide with each other, you have mechanical injury, and it takes a lot of parts out that may be able to be saved. So never do that. So 2/3 of the way through a 20-minute session or even a 30-minute session, especially in high ambient temperatures above about 87, 88 degrees, which is most of the south here, southeast, anytime after the end of May is going to have temperatures like that. Of course, Texas and in the southwest also ends up in that kind of category, even earlier in the year sometimes. And in Florida, it can happen any time of the year, even in January, okay? So if you fit that kind of mold for that, then maybe you have had a failure like this and you're the person that needs to view what I'm going to show you. So everything that I've learned about these engines as well as my team has come from things like this. Engines that have failed, things that have broken, things that did not end up the way they were designed. This has been our instructor to learn what we learn. We learn from the experiences of other people as well as ours because we're able to solve these things. So since basically taking the engine apart and learning what caused the failure is half of the solution to the problem, we have to pay a lot of attention to what happened first, the chicken or the egg, how in depth the failures are. Did the component get injured? Did it get taken out completely? Would somebody try to reuse it? What's the level of trauma? And again, what drove it? Did this engine run lean? If the engine was running lean and came apart, maybe the fuel pump's failing. Maybe somebody puts an engine back in the car and they have another failure because the fuel pump's going bad. We see this all the time. The fuel pump is your primary failure. That leads to secondary failure of the engine and tertiary damage to everything else. In that case, we have to learn those things and we have to look at the components. We have to see what the combustion chambers look like, what color they were, the color of the exhaust valves. All these things can tell us how the fuel mixture was and how the engine was running before it failed, as well as right when it did fail. So that's important because you can build $1 million engine and a $300 fuel pump can take it out. That's just one example. We see the same thing with O2 sensors. We see the same thing with coil packs that are misfiring, bad spark plugs that are causing misfires that make engines come apart. So it's important that you understand the things that have failed and get to the bottom of those things before you begin any type of reconstruction process. So now I want to familiarize you with the components that we've had fail in this engine, and we'll take it from there. So here, we have so many things going on that you can't tell what is what, okay? So some of the nomenclature of these major items, this would be the bank 1 crankcase half. That's the left side of the engine for basically cylinders 1, 2, and 3. This here is the crankshaft carrier. This assembly bolts in between the crankcase halves and it houses the crankshaft itself, as well as other subcomponents for the intermediate shaft tensioner paddle and things like that, okay? We have down here the actual intermediate shaft, okay? And it's sheared in half, by the way. I'm actually sticking my finger inside the intermediate shaft. The bearing did not fail, but the connecting rod literally hacked all the way through the intermediate shaft as it failed. That created another level of secondary, tertiary type damage. So here, I'm going to get some of this stuff out of the way just so we can kind of give you an example. But this is a wrist pin clip. So this is actually what holds in the wrist pin or the piston pin into the piston, okay? It's a bad day if you find your piston pin clip somewhere inside the engine other than inside the piston. We find these in the sump plate sometimes. If somebody misses a shift or something, they've literally popped out and the engine is running on a hope and a prayer. This one's in perfect condition. Literally the piston that it was inside of appears to have completely exploded and it just released and fell out. So that's what that is. Here is a piece of the cylinder wall. Can't tell what cylinder it came from because the debris field is so much here. But you can see that you've got the different layers of the lococil, the hardened surface. This is the actual parent material the cylinders are made from. So that's a big chunk of that. Here, this is a piece of a piston. And this, actually, if you look very closely here, still has the oil ring inside of it. Okay, so you can see that waffle of the oil ring expander there. Okay, so that's the piston or one of the pistons that literally exploded during this particular failure. A lot of plastic pieces. This plastic piece here just basically came off of what we call the crankshaft scraper or the windage tray. There's plastic all throughout the engine. Get some big pieces. This is actually a really big chunk of the crankshaft carrier. So the connecting rod, when the rod bolts broke on cylinder number 4 here, which is this particular connecting rod journal, that connecting rod came free and acted as a hatchet that actually broke this piece of the carrier out. That's a big, heavy chunk of aluminum. That's a very, very heavy part. There's a couple other pieces in here that we're getting to. Picture a piece of a piston ring. Okay, no big deal. That came off the piston that exploded. We have more cylinder wall here. These pieces, more cylinder wall there. I'm just going to try to get some of this stuff out of the way. Here's the gasket for the actual windage tray. You can see that's a pretty tough part. It actually lived through it. It got hacked in half, but I thought I could tear it, but it's a little bit too strong for that still. Another piece of that. So basically we have connecting rods that have failed literally on cylinders 4, cylinder 5, and cylinder 6. So this connecting rod for cylinder 4, you'll see it in a minute, it's actually jammed in the backside of the cylinder for cylinder 4. So the connecting rod and the piston are still in that particular cylinder in the block, okay? Then cylinder 5, that's the connecting rod that literally came down through this windage tray and hacked into the intermediate shaft and cut it in literally into 2 pieces. And we have a lot more pieces down here. I'm literally moving the connecting rod freely here until it hits the intermediate shaft. I'm going to grab a couple of tools and break some of this stuff away and see what we can see down inside there. All right, so I just went brutal there, kind of medieval tactics, and did what I needed to show you guys the shot here. So let me go ahead and get this out of the way. So here, this is the connecting rod for cylinder 5. So literally this rod, the connecting rod, broke in half. The rod bolts on this rod did not break. The rod bearing still feels as good as you can expect. Literally the connecting rod itself, the beam of the rod, has failed. And when that occurred, the rod came down and it acted as a hatchet that cut through the intermediate shaft. This was not an intermediate shaft failure. This was not an intermediate shaft bearing failure. This was literally secondary damage resulting from the rod breaking. That's taking out the intermediate shaft. Bearing's still good. I'm going to take the rest of it apart. That bearing's still okay, but the shaft itself has been sheared in 2. And that number 5 cylinder connecting rod is responsible for that. So you can see a lot more stuff broken around the bottom here. More pieces of the carrier, and literally at this time, this carrier is going to end up being a 2-piece carrier, I do believe. I think that rod has wiped everything out. So a little bit later when we pull all this apart, I believe we're going to end up with a carrier that's literally in 2 pieces. Okay, so as we further try to understand what happened first here, the chicken or the egg, I want to bring to your attention that, again, we only have one connecting rod that has become disconnected from the crankshaft. The others have stayed in place. Now that actually was a bad thing, because especially this cylinder 5 just kept rotating like a rotating connecting rod of death, if you will, taking out everything around it. Now with number 4 here having lost its connecting rod bolts, the rod bolts actually broke. The rod bolts, I do not believe in this case, were the primary failure. I believe they were a secondary failure because we ended up having a typical on-track experience where main bearings started to get hot, the oil started to shear down, debris was generated from the main bearings, which then lubricate the crankshaft bearings on the connecting rods, and if you start having wear on the main bearings, which are basically here on each one of these main caps, if you start having wear there, then the wear debris from that is then put in the engine oil that is lubricating the connecting rod bearings. So all the oil going through the mains ends up going to the rods. So a lot of times with these failures, we see a main bearing associated with a lot of wear adjacent to a connecting rod bearing. And that wear from the main bearing ends up sending a lot of debris out to the connecting rod bearing. It can't live with it. It starts to get extra clearance and it starts to bang around, and then you break the rod bolts, which is what you see here. So this is actually the big end, if you will, of the rod. And this bolt used to be here going through a piece of the connecting rod that we no longer have. It's somewhere inside all this debris field, okay? So literally where my thumb is here, there's supposed to be another piece of the connecting rod, the rod bearing cap is supposed to be there. So when this becomes disconnected, you'll pick up a big misfire. That cylinder no longer has a piston associated with it that's still reciprocating. And I've had this misdiagnosed or even partially diagnosed where my piston became disconnected from the crankshaft, okay? That usually comes from a general practitioner shop that doesn't understand these things, and they don't realize that the rod bolts that hold this rod together to the cap have failed and let that connecting rod fly off of the crankshaft, okay? So it looks like now we've got some more debris that I found down there, and I'm going to get a magnet and see if I can't fetch that. It looks like another piece of the rod here. Okay, it actually is. That is the piece of the equation that we were missing a second ago. Okay, so the way this is supposed to be, this bolt goes through here and connects to here. So as you can see, the rod bolt broke. Now, the rod bolts in these engines were not made for these kind of stresses. When we build these engines up, we throw these connecting rods away and we throw these rod bolts away. We don't use either one of those in any of our engines that are designed to go to the track because they are not rated for this type of trauma, okay? So it does appear in this scenario that the rod bolts broke on cylinder number 4 connecting rod. At that point in time, a lot of debris got scattered all throughout the engine. That debris was occurring at the speed of light sometimes, obviously. You can't see any of this stuff happening, and that created collateral damage that broke the pistons and cylinder pieces from these other cylinders on this same bank. And that is what made the connecting rod break, because now the piston exploded on that cylinder, then the rod starts banging around and the rod breaks. And the same thing happened, it appears, on cylinder 6. It's jammed in, I can't get it out. Maybe when I get some more of this stuff apart, we can see it. So at this point in time, this is very classic in the way that it did fail. It is very extreme in the extent of the damage, because rod bearing failed due to contaminated oil, due to thermal breakdown from the oil getting too hot on the track, or using the wrong viscosity of oil, or not servicing the oil frequently enough when going on the track. And when that occurs, you have a situation that creates a rod bolt that breaks. This becomes disconnected. Everything starts to go downhill from there, okay? So now I want to shift focus to the other bank of the engine, where the connecting rod that remains from here is now jammed with its piston, so we can help you understand more about what happened on that side of the engine. So here I am on the bank 2 crankcase half, okay? Here we have cylinders 4, 5, and 6. Now, the one thing I want to bring to your attention is you can have a rod bolt failure with no other primary underlying problem going on. You can have good oil system, you can have, your G-forces are controlled, you got the proper oil at the right place at the right time with the right quantity. You can do all those things right. You can buy every bolt-on known to man, but there's nothing that's going to basically overcome the fact that this engine has connecting rod bolts and connecting rods that fail under the stresses of track surface. Until you take the engine apart and you replace those pieces with things that are built to be stronger and longer lasting under higher RPM use, you're never going to get away from that. You can literally have connecting rod bolts break without anything happening as an underlying cause, okay? It happens sometimes. That did not happen in this case. And the way I can tell this is because the connecting rod here is black. It shows me that it's been very hot. In cases where the rod bolts break, this will not be black. It'll look virgin, because literally those connecting rod bolts snap and there's no excess heat generated. This component was running excessively hot because it did not have a proper flow of oil, or it had increased wear from the debris that was being fed to it from an adjacent main bearing that was failing, which is what we see all the time. Most of these cases end up with a main bearing that starts the wear that then degrades to this point, and you have a connecting rod bearing fail, because the connecting rod bearings are much less forgiving to debris and changes. So the load is on the connecting rod bearings because they see reciprocation. Your main bearings only see radial wear. There's no reciprocating wear at all, or loads like that. Basically we're taking that radial motion of the crankshaft and we're starting reciprocation with the connecting rods. So as you increase the stroke of the crankshaft, these things come into play more, okay? So I know this one didn't just break the bolts because the bolts were weak. I know this one failed due to heat, because this has gotten black after it's been excessively hot, okay? So now keep in mind, I told you this failure started on cylinder 4. That's the only one that broke the rod bolts. This further proves that. Cylinders 5 and 6, their pistons exploded. They are obliterated. They are no longer in the game. They are gone, because pieces of debris from this explosion that happened on cylinder 4 then bounced around everywhere inside this side of the engine, started creating a lot of havoc. That blew the pistons and the connecting rods apart on these other 2 cylinders. Then the connecting rods start cleaning things out as they reciprocate, and the radial thrust of things just start going downhill. Okay, so cylinder 4 fails, takes out cylinder 5, takes out cylinder 6. A lot of this then cross-pollinates across the engine and takes out the other bank, okay? So when you're looking at which happened first, the chicken or the egg, cylinder 4 was the chicken, 5 and 6 were the egg. And let's just say this egg's rotten. So now I have the sump plate here. Now this sump plate is the bottom of the oil system. The oil pickup tube collects its oil from here. This sump plate is the window to the soul of the M96, M97 engine. This sump plate will tell you a lot about what lurks deeper inside the engine. When you have a failure, a lot of that debris, gravity will deliver it back down to the sump plate. So will the timing chains. They act as conveyor belts to deliver things back down to the bottom of the engine. So this bolts onto the bottom of the engine with 13 fasteners, okay? Those are easy to remove. You can have this sump plate off of your engine in less than 20 minutes after you drain the oil, even if you're a slow worker, okay? Since this is the window to the soul of the engine, if you've experienced a failure, don't let your shop run you around. The shop might already know that you've got a massive engine failure. They're trying to maximize the amount of money they can make off of your scenario because they know they're not going to build the engine. They know it's probably over their head. So they're going to bore scope things. They're going to bring all this stuff up trying to find out what's wrong when they know how bad it is. Not all shops are like that, but they have to make money somehow, okay? So if you've had an on-track failure, you've had smoke, you've had noise, you've heard a bang, any of those things, you lost power, the wise man will pull this sump plate off first. The very first thing you do is remove this sump plate. If you find a debris field like what we've got here, if you find rubble, it's game over. You need an engine, and you need a core engine because your trauma is to the point where only a fool would trust to put this engine back together, or someone who's working against a budget at a shop that doesn't know what we know. So keep that in mind. The first thing to do is pop the sump plate off. You can even do it at home. 13 fasteners. It either takes an E10 or a 10 millimeter hex to be able to pull this off. That's all it takes. After you drain the oil, you pry it right off the side with a pry bar. It comes right off after you break the sealant seal on the thing, and you can see what we see. Now, if you pop it off and you don't have a bunch of debris here, that's good. If you pop it off and you have some small metallic pieces that are copper in color, you also have a failure. It hasn't gotten this far yet, but the copper is coming from your connecting rod bearings and the main bearings. If you find the copper here or in the oil filter, then it's also going to be game over for you. Not quite game over as bad as it is for this individual because he has nothing we can reuse. There's nothing in this engine that will be reused. The only reason I took this apart was to continue my learning process and to share this with you, okay? So I want to take you through a couple of the things we find in here. Again, we've got another one of the rod caps, okay? Actually, that's the one I showed you earlier, matter of fact. This is the other one. So you can see here the rod bolt is still inside of that end of the connecting rod. Now that's what I showed you in the previous photo where that, or previous part of the video where the end of the connecting rod was black. That's part of that, okay? And then here we're finding mostly pistons. This is mostly the debris from the pistons that exploded after the failure occurred. And I can just go through and dig more and more and more of this stuff out of here. And I keep all this here at my training facility with a knowledge group, so when you guys come to classes, you can see this. Because you can't make this up. We couldn't even try to do this. I've tried to blow engines up and get this kind of result, and I've never been able to do it because we learn from offerings to the gods of speed. So piston rings, more pieces of the block, pieces of the crankshaft carrier, pieces of the piston. The pistons for cylinders 5 and 6 no longer exist. They have completely obliterated. This is another one of the wrist pin clips or piston pin clips. That one did not have a good day. He got caught between something else during that failure. Here's another one of those. It looks a little better than the last one. All sorts of pieces here. We have some pieces that are not accounted for that we think may be in the engine bay of the car. This failure was so radical that it even knocked the starter motor loose from the engine where it bolts on. It literally broke the starter motor, and it also broke off the power steering fluid reservoir which then ended up creating a small fire on top of the engine because that power steering fluid is quite flammable on top of a hot engine. So this is what's left of the oil level sending unit, and it's just a plastic sword that goes inside the engine, but as you can see, it didn't fare very well. Okay, so now that I've kind of taken you through what we found in the sump plate here, which is a whole lot of nothing anymore, now we're going to pull a couple fasteners out and dump out the debris field from that bank one of the crankcase. So now I'm back on bank one here. We've got the mass destruction. It's time to remove the crankshaft carrier from the crankshaft, or crankcase, if you will, for bank one. So, you know, just because I don't care about any of these components, I'm just going to roll it upside down, let it fall into the catch basin, if you will, here, and then we'll look at the pieces from that point. So I'm just going to try to roll it over. I may have to pry it out. Not sure how in there it is. Yeah. There came some of our pieces. Okay. And I'm just going to all right, the carrier is in two pieces. It's pretty clear to see that. So you can see how half of it's moving and the other half's not. So now I have the crankshaft carrier taken out of our junk pile here, and this is the carrier assembly. Inside of this, I found a piece of the crankcase, this little waffle-looking design on top of this. That's actually from the block, so that was down inside the carrier. I want to bring your attention to the intermediate shaft, which was sheared in half. And you know, these engines have problems that are bigger than the intermediate shaft bearing, especially the M97. This has the large diameter M97 bearing. It spins fine. This bearing has no problem, okay? This bearing has no issue whatsoever, even after all this trauma that it's seen. Also the other end, which has the plain bearing, which is like my IMS solution, this still spins freely. A part of the front console on the back side of the oil pump that supports this end of the intermediate shaft here still spins freely. That's not worn, that's not damaged. The shaft is junk. That's a pretty good trophy. So this one I'll make a lamp out of, and I'll probably end up selling it on eBay. So if you like things blown up, go check out eBay. We put some stuff on there sometimes like that. So cylinder 5 connecting rod hacked its way through the intermediate shaft, okay? Now I want to bring you to your attention here that cylinder number 5 connecting rod. And this is it. As you can see, it spins freely, no big deal, okay? What I want to show you is the crankshaft carrier, that actually this whole housing is in two pieces. So I can literally take this, hold one part of it, and rotate the other part, okay? So this has been hacked in two by this particular number 5 connecting rod, okay? There's other pieces of block down here. Cylinder number 6, its connecting rod also failed, like I had showed you. So that's pretty much the failure for this one. Cylinder 4 was what caused it. Cylinder 5 and 6 made it worse and took out everything else in the engine. So what have we learned? I can't go over and tell you everything it takes to keep one of these engines alive on the track. If I did, I would just basically tell you, buy my Stage 2 track performer. But this is not a video about selling you something. So I'm going to try to help you avoid this from happening, because we can't build all the engines that come to us like this. An engine this traumatic can't be built. It can't be rebuilt. And you should not try to rebuild it. All this should go to the scrapyard. Keep your ancillary components, your alternator, things like that, and put those on another long block engine and start over. Don't even think about saving anything from this one, okay? If you want to try to avoid this, and you have good luck, because at the end of the day, luck is everything. You can do everything right and still have this happen. You can miss a shift and have this happen. So some of the things that I tell people to avoid to hopefully mitigate the chances of this occurring: don't use a short shifter in your car. Short shift kits reduce the longitudinal throw of the shifter, but they also reduce the lateral throw. Even though they're advertised that they don't, it makes it very easy to do a 5th gear to a 2nd gear downshift instead of a 5th gear to a 4th gear downshift. We see engines all the time that are failed from 5th to 2nd downshifts. We know that did not happen with this engine. This engine came apart on acceleration at Mid-Ohio, okay? It was in like 4th gear, at the top end of 4th gear, when it decided to come apart. It had no symptoms. The engine was running fine all through the session until that occurred. All of a sudden, big bang, big smoke. Luckily, the guy didn't spin in his own oil, got it to the side of the track, clunk, clunk, engine's locked up, wouldn't start. That's what happened with this one. That a lot of times will happen. A lot of times I get a phone call from a guy who says, I was at Sebring this weekend, and I say, sir, please allow me to take the words out of your mouth. I say, you went through turn 17, 2/3 of the way through a 20 or 30 minute session, and all of a sudden you had a loud bang, you saw some smoke, and you ended up on the right side of the track after turn 17. He said, how did you know? Were you there? I said, no, sir. I get this phone call all the time, and that is a notorious place for these engines failing, okay? We see it a lot. That's just one example. Back straightaway at Road Atlanta. After you go through all the corners, you get on the back straightaway, usually about turn 8, which is really not a turn unless you're going like 150 or so a lot of times, engine will come apart. We get that phone call all the time. So how do you hopefully avoid these things? One, change the engine oil before you go to the track every time. Use a proper engine oil. I'm not going to give you a recommendation for oil because I'm an oil developer. I'm biased about what I do. I'm just going to tell you the things that you've been told to do are not what's best for the engine, okay? What's best for the engine is an oil that is developed for the track. It has a high viscosity index. It can take extreme thermals. It can maintain its viscosity above 220 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of street oils that are made for the street lose a lot of viscosity above 220. They may lose 20%, 30% of their viscosity in a 20-degree range, okay? You end up with an oil that's supposed to be a 40 grade, it ends up being a 20 grade because it's so hot. The engine oil can't keep up, wear goes through the roof, debris gets generated, and you have a massive failure like this, okay? So the right oil at the right place, in the right quantity, at the right time is the key. Changing that oil after the track is also a key. A lot of people look at me and they say, that's crazy, I'm wasting a lot of money. This is $30,000. If you have to come to me with an engine this level of trauma, this is $30,000. You go spend $2,000 on tires for your car to go to the track, and you'll do that. But you don't want to spend a couple of $100 in oil, okay? That's penny wise and pound foolish. Spend the money on the engine oil, change it frequently, and you won't have to call me, more than likely, unless you had a bad day at the track that's better than a good day at the office, okay? So if I had to tell you things that would really keep the engine alive, right oil, right place, right time, right quantity, those things are the key. Now, there's a lot of bolt-ons, even some that I've developed with LN Engineering. Better sump plates that hold the oil where it needs to be. Baffles, things like this, AccuSump systems. All of these things can help, but they're literally Band-Aids, okay? You're putting Band-Aids on an engine that does not have the clearances internally to operate properly on the street and on the track. Engines that operate on the track need more open clearances. They need to be specifically built with the components and the clearances internally to live, okay? You can put all the bolt-ons you want on this engine, but it's literally a Band-Aid. At the end of the day, if you plan to really track the car, preemptively consider an engine build with Flat 6 Innovations that will help you mitigate the chances of having a failure of this epic proportion. So thank you for viewing another exploratory engine disassembly here with RenVision. I want to thank you from the Flat 6 Innovations and Knowledge Group team. I want to make sure that you like and subscribe to our channel and our Facebook page. And also make sure you join the newsletter list at the Knowledge Group to learn more about our hands-on and online training classes.